Why staying single is the best thing you can do. Have you ever felt like you were somehow broken just because you're single? No one says it outright, but their looks say enough. They look at you like you're missing something essential to be a whole person, to walk beside you, a name to add to the Christmas card, someone to prove you're not just unloved. In America, people don't say it out loud, but it seeps into every conversation, every glance at gatherings, every seemingly harmless question. Like, so anyone new lately? Still single? How is someone like you still on your own? Bit by bit, you start to question yourself. Why am I still alone? Is there something wrong with me that others don't have? Then you open Tinder swiping nonstop, not to find someone, but because you're afraid of being left behind. You agree to hang out with people you're not even into, just because spending another weekend alone in your apartment feels weird. And then you get into relationships, are going nowhere, but you hold on anyway because at least you look like everyone else. I know what that feels like because I've lived it. I used to date like a machine, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid not to. I said yes to invites when I felt nothing inside. I lay next to people and felt like I was living someone else's life. But I kept going because I told myself, at least I don't have to face loneliness. Then one night after a fight, not big, not small, not enough to break up over, but just enough to drain me, I asked myself, why am I here? What am I doing? And no answer came, just one raw truth: I was afraid of being alone. That's when I started reading about Stoicism, not as some lofty philosophy to show off, but as a lifeline for the mind. What Marcus Aurelius wrote didn't feel like comfort, it felt like a slap to wake me up. Confine yourself to the present, not the past, not the future scenarios you dream up. Just this moment alone, quiet face to face with yourself. I'd lived too long with the fantasy that having someone beside me would make me more complete. But Stoicism doesn't say that. Epictetus reminds us, you cannot be free if you let someone else control your emotions. I realized the reason I always needed someone near wasn't because I needed them, it was because I didn't know how to sit with my own emotions. And whenever I ran from loneliness into someone else's arms, I gave up another piece of my self-control. Seneca said scarcity creates value. I had made myself too available, too easy to enter without asking if someone deserved to be there. And in doing so, I lost value not in their eyes, but in how I saw myself. In a country where everyone's busy with work, emails, deadlines, and pretending to be fine, it's easy to believe you're only really living if you're in love. But here's something nobody tells you. Many people in relationships aren't happy. They're afraid to turn off the lights in a room where the only voice left is theirs. And if you're single, don't think of yourself as lacking. You're just standing at a milestone. Most people avoid facing yourself without someone else's reflection in the mirror. Suppose you've ever felt like a half waiting to be matched. Stay till the end of this video, not so I can convince you to love or not to love, but to offer you something Stoicism gave me. You don't need anyone to become the full version of yourself. Wholeness doesn't come from a confession of love. It comes from the moment you say, I choose me. And that's the first step toward freedom. I used to work at a media company in New York where answering emails at 2 a.m. was treated like a badge of honor. No one told you to stay up, but someone else would if you didn't reply fast. And then you'd slowly find yourself pushed out of the game quietly, bit by bit. But the scarier part, after a while, no one had to make you anymore. You trained yourself to react like a machine. New message, respond immediately. Midnight call, please pick it up. A meeting that overlaps with lunch, skip the meal, not because you wanted to, but because you believed you had to, just to be seen, remembered, and hang on to connections that felt like lifelines. And that's how you start losing ownership of your own life. Stoicism isn't about shutting yourself away or ignoring the world. It's about asking one tricky question: who's in control of my reactions? One day I read a line from Epictetus: you cannot be free if you let others control your response. That hit me like a knife. I realized I'd been reacting like a remote I lit up anytime someone pushed a button. A partner felt sad, I dropped everything and ran to them. A friend got mad, I sat for hours explaining myself even when I'd done nothing wrong. A boss was in a mood, I gave up my weekend to smooth things over. And then I had to ask, were any of those reactions really my choice, or were they just reflexes powered by fear of being left behind? Marcus Aurelius called it the inner citadel, a stronghold inside you where you can retreat when the world gets too loud. In that place, you don't have to perform. You don't have to force anything. You get to be yourself. But the truth is, most of us are afraid to build that citadel because it forces you to accept one thing: no one is coming to save you but you. And to do that, you need something the modern world does everything to avoid: solitude. Sounds strange. A philosophy about living in the world telling you to be alone. But Stoicism understands this solitude isn't emptiness. It's stillness, a space where you can reshape yourself. We live in a time where every quiet moment gets filled with noise, short videos, podcasts, messages, notifications. The second you feel a gap, you scroll. The second you feel sad, you call someone. The second you feel scared, you look for someone to share it with. But have you ever asked yourself, if you can't be alone, then who are you living with? Seneca said something I'll never forget: scarcity creates value. I used to think love meant always being available, but really that made me cheapen myself. Because if you're always there, no boundaries, no filter, you become a convenience. And people don't value what's too easy. I started trying something simple, not replying to messages right away. At first it felt wrong, like I was doing something bad. But then I saw the world kept turning. People kept going. And what shocked me more was that I felt lighter. A little space opened up, and in that space I could breathe. After that burnout, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to face before. Am I living my own life, or just playing the role of the useful one in someone else's? That one question made me re-examine all the tiny habits I'd overlooked. And one thing stood out most clearly: I was always available, always on, always reacting. And that's when I realized I was caught in a trap, not loud, not obvious, but more dangerous than any rejection. The trap of always being available. I used to think I had to be available to earn respect and love from others, ready to help, ready to reply, prepared to listen no matter what I was doing. At first, it seemed like a good thing, a way to prove that I was thoughtful, caring, reliable. But you know what? It's a trap, a sweet one, but one that quietly wears you down from the inside. In the US where I lived, this mindset has even become an unspoken work ethic. Constant 24/7 availability is no longer the exception. It's become the standard. Slack doesn't care about business hours. Emails don't wait until morning. If you don't reply to a message at 11 p.m., you feel guilty, like you're slacking off, like you're not doing your part. The same goes for friends. They text you to vent, unload, share their stress, and if you don't respond fast enough, they ask, "Hey, what's up with you? Don't care anymore." And so you force yourself to reply even when your mind's a blur and your heart is tangled. You push yourself to show up even though mentally you checked out long ago. Sound familiar? If it does, you might be caught in the trap of always being available, a subtle emotional servitude. You become a free emotional support service for everyone except yourself. I've been there. Some days I'd get over 50 messages from different groups, clients, friends, family exes. Each one needed a response. Every conversation pulled me further away from myself. I lived in a constant state of reaction, like a firefighter on duty, always ready to run into the flames. And of course, what had to happen eventually did happen. I burned out. I couldn't sleep. I started doubting every relationship, not because people were bad, but because I no longer had the energy to be present in any real way. When I started learning about Stoicism, one line from Epictetus hit me hard. You cannot be free if you let others control your response. I realized every time I responded instantly to a message, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid I was handing the reins of my life to someone else. And by doing that, I gave up my freedom. I was living on someone else's emotional schedule. Marcus Aurelius called that scattering the soul, when your mind gets pulled in too many directions by things that aren't yours. In Meditations, he wrote, "Build yourself a fortress within no one can enter it. Inside it lies true freedom." And Seneca gave this warning, "What is always available becomes cheap. Don't let your presence become a commodity." That line shook me. I saw it clearly. I was devaluing myself by being constantly available. My weight started to decrease. Every message I replied to instantly made people assume I had nothing more important to do. And eventually that became the truth. I didn't have anything more important than pleasing other people. So I started making changes. I stopped replying immediately. No more seen than respond right away. I let the messages sit. I turned on focus mode. I started practicing something simple, intentional disappearance. At first, it scared me. I was afraid people would misunderstand. I was terrified of losing relationships. But then something strange happened. I felt better. I started spending time with my own thoughts. I listened to my body. I paid attention to my emotions without constant interruption from non-urgent messages. More importantly, I started feeling valuable again. Not because someone texted, "Thanks for being there," but because I knew I was tending to the most important relationship in my life, the one with myself. The trap of always being available is this: it makes you think you're more connected, but you're just more fragmented. You lose a little piece of yourself every time you show up without meaning it. And one day you won't even know who you are outside of all the roles other people cast you in. But to escape that trap, you must face a deep fear of being alone, the fear of being left behind, the fear that no one really needs you. And that's precisely where Stoic philosophy offers a different lens. Loneliness isn't the enemy, it's the doorway to freedom. Loneliness versus solitude, a crucial difference. When I started turning off phone notifications, declining unnecessary hangouts, and choosing to sit alone in a cafe instead of joining the drama update crowd, something strange happened. I started to feel lonely. But soon after I realized something was off about that feeling. Loneliness shouldn't come from a quiet afternoon with a warm cup of coffee. Loneliness shouldn't show up when I hear the wind pass by my ears and feel my mind finally calm down after days of tension. So what was that feeling? That's when I realized something. We've been taught the wrong idea of being alone. Modern society especially, American culture where I live, blends two things that only seem similar: loneliness and solitude. But the Stoics didn't confuse them. They made the difference clear. Loneliness is when you're alone and feel empty, afraid, lacking. It's a passive state, like you've been left behind. According to Marcus Aurelius, solitude is the active state of a strong mind. When you are alone, you can reconnect with yourself undisturbed, uninterrupted, and without playing a role. So I started paying closer attention to myself every time that lonely feeling showed up. I asked, am I really missing people, or am I just unfamiliar with being with myself? Stoicism taught me that you only fear being alone when you haven't yet learned to befriend yourself. Why do you turn the TV on when you walk in the door? Why do you scroll through social media for an hour to avoid an empty moment? Because that emptiness is scary, because you start to hear your authentic voice in that silence. Even while ruling the largest empire in the world at the time, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, still wrote down his thoughts in the solitude of night. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Strength doesn't come from the crowd, it comes from stillness, where you regain control of your mind. I realized the more comfortable I became with solitude, the less lonely I felt. And eventually I even started to enjoy solitude as a privilege, like leaving a loud party and finally hearing your own heartbeat. Have you ever felt that a night with no texts, plans, or deadlines, just you in the quiet, and instead of feeling empty, you feel free? Light. That's the gift of intentional solitude. Seneca once said, "If you want to rest, withdraw not just from the crowd, but from yourself." Solitude isn't a harsh condition, it's mental training for our grown-ups. When you face yourself in silence, you reach a depth no relationship can touch. But here's the thing, this is when society starts to resist you. When you stop chasing plans, when you're no longer living like someone waiting to be invited, and when you're not afraid to say, "Today I want to be alone," you become different. And difference always makes people uncomfortable. They call you cold, distant, antisocial, not okay. But you're doing something most people haven't had the courage to do, becoming your own partner. One day I walked in the park without my phone, just me, the trees, the breeze, and a few stray leaves. No calls, no messages, no small talk. Some people looked at me strangely, like I was missing out. But I knew I wasn't lost. I had just stepped away from a race I never signed up for. Stoicism doesn't tell you to live like a hermit or reject relationships. It simply reminds you no one can be your home except you. If you always need someone else to feel worthy, you've handed over the keys to your life. And in doing so, you'll always depend on their emotions, presence, and approval. I used to think I can't live alone. But when I started practicing Stoicism by journaling every morning, spending at least 15 minutes a day, just thinking without distractions, going for walks without my phone, and simply learning how to breathe, I realized the ability to be alone is a survival skill. And from that solitude, I began to understand myself better. I learned what I liked, what I didn't, what hurt me, and what made me stronger. I no longer used people to hide my inner mess. I no longer searched for someone compatible to patch up what felt missing inside me. And you know what happened next? The relationships I kept became deeper. Because they weren't built on fear of being alone, they were built on conscious choice. I didn't need anyone to feel whole. And because of that, I no longer put the weight on anyone else to make me happy. That's when I understood more clearly than ever, loneliness is fear, but solitude is strength. And when you step out from the shadow of loneliness into the light of solitude, you start to see something quietly powerful. You were already whole long before anyone else showed up. The inner fortress and the art of selective presence. One day, while rereading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius at a small cafe, I came across a passage that stopped me for a long time. He wrote, "People try to escape to the countryside, to the sea, to the mountains. But that's foolish, because at any moment you can retreat into yourself." At that moment, I understood that Stoics don't seek peace outside. They build it from within like an inner fortress. And I began to ask myself, am I living in a house without walls or doors where anyone can walk in at any time, just with a message, a request, or a disappointed look? That's what many of us are doing. We let people enter our minds like it's a marketplace. No control, no filter, no boundaries. And then we wonder why we're exhausted, fragmented, and lost. Marcus wasn't just talking about quiet. He was pointing to personal sovereignty, a fortress we can retreat to whenever we need to regain balance. That fortress doesn't need bricks. It's a mental boundary. It's the ability to say no without guilt. It's the discernment to decide who gets access to your mental space. It's the skill of protecting your presence from pointless drains. Have you ever answered a call knowing it would ruin your mood just because you didn't want to say no? Or checked your email at midnight because your boss might notice you didn't respond? If so, congratulations, you're living without a fortress. A fortress doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't make you cold or avoidant. It helps you recognize what's worthy of your energy. It's a kind of art selective presence, and it's hard but worth mastering. Seneca wrote, "A wise person chooses who gets to sit in their mind the way they choose who enters their home." So why do we let dozens of people into our heads every day through social media, texts, calls, even when we don't truly need or want them there? Stoicism teaches us that the world will invade without hesitation if you don't protect your space. That's why I started practicing something small but impactful, turning off notifications. You wouldn't believe it, just that one change felt like locking the gates of a fortress that had been wide open for years, no longer forced to respond instantly and no longer dragged by other people's emotions. I began choosing when to be present instead of always being available. And that changed how I lived. Many people think if I don't reply quickly, they'll get mad and think I'm rude. But the truth is the opposite. People start to respect you more when you hold your boundaries firmly and kindly. They know if you respond, it's because you choose to not, because you feel forced to. I remember once an old friend texted me at 11 p.m. with the same story they'd shared many times. In the past, I would have stayed up until 1 a.m. listening, giving advice, trying to help them feel better. But this time I saw the message, put my phone down, and didn't reply. I felt no guilt. And the next morning I messaged back and said, I couldn't be their emotional night shift. I needed sleep, silence, and time to care for myself. You know what their reaction was? Not anger. They said, thanks for being honest. That moment gave me a powerful realization. Every time you protect your space, you're not just protecting yourself, you're teaching others how to respect your boundaries. An inner fortress doesn't build itself. It's the result of knowing who you are, what you want, what you're willing to give, and refusing to trade your peace for things that don't matter. When you've built that fortress, you begin to walk into the world with a different energy. You're no longer the overly nice person, always available, always saying yes, constantly drained because you're scared someone might feel bad. You become a sovereign individual, someone whose presence is a gift, not an obligation. And when your presence is given with intention, it becomes more valuable. People listen to you more. They know you're not speaking to fill the silence. You're talking because you have something to say. They don't take your presence for granted. They know you're offering them the most precious thing. You have your time and attention. Stoicism doesn't ask you to reject the world. It simply asks you not to let the world invade your mind. The inner fortress is not a place to hide. It's a place to restore, reset, and return to the world stronger and wiser. And one day you'll realize that when every invitation no longer pulls you drama or expectation from others, you finally start living your own life. Learning to say no without feeling guilty, the power of kind refusal. When I started living with a Stoic mindset, I ran into a problem that seemed simple but incredibly hard. How do you say no without feeling like a bad person? Once a coworker invited me to join a side project after hours. I had already worked through the week without a break, completely drained, but my mouth still said, yeah, let me check my schedule. Of course, everyone knows that means I'll try to make it work. But I felt like I had just betrayed myself the moment I said it. That feeling of betraying your legitimate exhaustion to make someone else happy haunted me for a long time. Until I read a line from Seneca. He wrote up, a person who doesn't know how to say no will waste themselves on things that don't matter. Short, direct, no exception. And I realized being overly available isn't kindness, it's a form of self-abandonment. We grow up believing that saying no is rude, selfish, and unkind. But Stoicism teaches the opposite. Someone who knows how to say no at the right time is someone who understands the value of their yes. If you can't say no to small things, you are giving up your chance to say yes to what truly matters. I remember the first time I practiced saying no intentionally. An old friend messaged me asking me to join a hangout with the group I knew would end in wasted time and meaningless chatter. In the past, I would have forced myself to go, maybe something fun will happen, or I don't want to kill the vibe. But this time I just replied, thanks for the invite, but I need a quiet night. Hope you all have fun. No excuses, no over-explaining, just a kind refusal. And you know what happened? That friend replied, wow, that actually sounds great. I could use a detox too. Keep me posted. I suddenly understood when you live honestly with your needs, you unintentionally inspire others to do the same. And that's more beautiful than any yes said to keep the peace. Here's the truth. Every yes you say is spending your time, energy, and presence. And if you don't manage it, others will pay you like a free resource, not out of malice, but because you didn't set the limit. Epictetus once said, "We cannot control others, only how we respond." So if someone's upset that you said no, that's their issue, not yours. You're not responsible for making everyone comfortable. You're only responsible for protecting your peace, clarity, and boundaries. From then on, I started using a simple rule. Every invitation, request, and message has to go through one filter. Does this align with the best version of me? If the answer is no, I also say no, not because I'm rude, but because I'm honest. Not because I'm cold, but because I'm already warm enough with myself. I don't need to burn out to keep someone else warm. And here's the surprising part. The more you practice saying no, the more you realize people don't react as negatively as you imagine. Most of the fear comes from you, from made-up scenarios about anger, disappointment, or rejection. But when you say no, clearly, kindly, and consistently, people respect you more. They also learn from your example how to protect their energy. And most importantly, you start to see your time as a limited currency and learn to spend it wisely. When you stop jumping at every invite, stop trying to rescue everyone, stop showing up to avoid making others uncomfortable, you finally start showing up for yourself. You get time to read without interruption. You get a quiet Sunday morning to walk and think about life. You can turn your phone off at night, sit by candlelight, and write down what you long for. And you'll realize the moment you learn to say no correctly, you also learn to love yourself more deeply. Stoicism isn't against emotion. It's against wasting mental energy on things that don't deserve it. And sometimes a gentle no is the highest form of love for others and yourself. Calm in the storm, the quiet strength of being single. What made me realize that modern life in America feels like a never-ending whirlwind? It was the moment I was sitting in a cafe in Seattle, a steaming latte in front of me, while my mind was spinning with 3 meetings, 2 unanswered emails, and a text from my ex asking, "Hey, how have you been?" I forced a smile, not because I was happy, but because I felt myself being pulled in 100 directions. Work, emotions, obligations, and worst of all, expectations. To most people, this would feel like a busy life. But for someone who's been through the journey of living alone and building inner strength like I have, I knew this was the sign of an emotional storm coming. People often think living alone means being lonely, but in truth, when there's no one to lean on, you must find a way to stay grounded in the chaos. And you know what? The storm doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it lives entirely in your head. Anxiety, pressure, expectations, regrets, undefined relationships. Everyone sometimes gets caught in their emotions, but not everyone learns how to stay still. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." It sounds simple, but living that truth in modern American life is an art form. When you live alone, there's no one to comfort you, no hug waiting, no kind words standing by. You're forced to give those things to yourself. And it's in those moments that calm is forged. I remember getting laid off unexpectedly in the middle of winter during a wave of mass layoffs across the economy. I came home to an empty apartment. No one is waiting. No sound except my breath and a racing heartbeat. But instead of turning on Netflix to escape or calling someone to vent, I sat on the floor, opened Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and read, "If it's outside your control, let it go." That sentence, read in complete silence, felt like a slap that woke me up. I couldn't undo being laid off, but I could choose how to respond. And I decided on stillness, discipline, and continuation. When you live alone, you don't get the luxury of unloading your emotions onto someone else. When you're hurt, you have to stitch the wound yourself. When you're angry, you must learn how to breathe independently. You have to find direction without anyone leading the way when you're lost. It's not easy, but it builds a kind of inner strength, quiet, deep, and untouchable. Epictetus once taught, It's not what happens to you that hurts, it's how you interpret it. When you live alone long enough, your view of things shifts. Failure stops being an ending, it becomes data. Rejection stops being personal, it becomes clarity. And silence stops feeling scary, it becomes the space where you rebuild yourself. I once met a friend in New York. She's been single for over 10 years, has no marriage and has no kids. She's one of the calmest people I've ever met. She works in finance, high pressure nonstop, but you'll never see her lose her temper or react impulsively. One day I asked her what her secret was. She just smiled. I live alone, so when emotions rise, there's no one to dump them on. I have to process them for real, not perform. And when you do that enough times, you start to know what's real and what's just noise. That solitude becomes fertile ground for emotional self-mastery. When you live with yourself, you're forced to become your own life partner. You learn how to talk to yourself. You learn to recognize when you're overreacting, when you need rest, and when it's time to let go. You don't need someone to remind you to breathe. You have already noted that you've been holding your breath. And the strange thing is that when you can stay calm in the storm, you do not just save yourself, you become a safe place for others. In a world where everyone's overreacting, the person who can remain still becomes magnetic. Not because they're better, but because they were not swept away. They're someone who chooses their response, not someone ruled by the emotion of the moment. Don't get me wrong, being single doesn't make you a superhero. You still have nights when your chest tightens, when you cry in a parking lot, when you wake up and feel like there's no purpose. But with every one of those moments, you build another layer of armor, not to numb yourself, but to walk through the emotion without being consumed. When you spend enough time in silence, you realize inner strength isn't explosive power. It's the ability to stay standing in the chaos. Not everyone needs you, but when they do, they know you're the one who won't shake. And when you can stay calm in what feels like endless waves of noise and demands, you begin to see something clearly. Not everyone who enters your life deserves access to your mind. Not every request deserves a reply. Not every relationship deserves to continue just because it once existed. Only when you gain control over your emotions can you start setting boundaries. And that's when one question becomes crystal clear. Is your presence being wasted on things that aren't worth it? Let's talk about the right to say no, the quiet sovereignty only influential people dare to use. Saying no is choosing. Not everyone deserves your presence. Since living in the US, I've noticed something strange. Modern society worships connection, but confuses kindness with the inability to say no. Every invitation, urgent email, and, "Hey, can you do me a quick favor?" is a quiet test to see if you can hold your boundaries. And most of the time we fail. Not because we're weak, but because we're afraid of judgment, fearful of being called selfish, scared of letting people down. So we say yes even when it costs us time, energy, and worse, ourselves. I used to be that person. Always polite, always available, was saying okay, even when every part of me screamed no. But then I realized every time I couldn't say no to someone else, I was saying no to myself. The Stoics call that a surrender of sovereignty when you hand over control of your emotions, time, and mental space to others. Epictetus once said, "You control only two things, your actions and your responses. Everything else is beyond you." But if you can't say no, you're no longer responding, you're reacting to someone else's script. And that's not really you anymore. Imagine this, you're a builder constructing an inner fortress. Every hour of your day is a brick, but a brick gets pulled out every time you give in to keep the peace. At first you think it's harmless, but when the wall finally collapses, you realize you've lived without a foundation for far too long. Seneca once wrote, "Scarcity creates value." That applies to people too. If you're always available, working around other people's schedules and responding instantly, you might be polite, but you're no longer valuable. You become predictable, replaceable, and easy to take for granted. People who live alone are often misunderstood as cold or self-absorbed, but they have one advantage which few will admit: they know how to draw the line. Not because they don't care, but because they understand the value of their presence. I had a friend who was always saying she felt lonely. She kept falling into toxic relationships simply out of fear of being left behind. She couldn't say no to anyone, not to her ex-friends. She couldn't stand or even to casual hangouts that drained her. One day she burned out, and then she cried and said something I'll never forget: "I don't know who I am anymore." And that's the cost of never saying no. You lose your identity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote about the inner citadel, a space inside you that no one can access unless you open the gate. But if you don't practice the discipline of refusal, your gate is always wide open. You allow people to walk in, rearrange your thoughts, and leave whenever they please. A true Stoic knows that saying no isn't rejection, it's intentional selection. You don't say no because you're angry or think you're above anyone. You say no because you're protecting something more important: your time spent living in alignment with yourself. Look back at your past week. How many times did you say yes out of guilt? How often did you answer a message right away, even though you were in a moment that needed silence? How many social obligations did you agree to get through only to sit there counting the minutes until you could leave? Those things don't just cost time. They drain your strength. They turn you into a shell version of yourself, social, polite, but empty. And the danger is you start getting used to it. You forget you once had the right to choose. Stoicism doesn't ask you to isolate yourself or cut off every relationship, but it does ask you to audit them. Is this connection nourishing you or quietly draining you? If it's the latter, you have the right and the responsibility to say no. Saying no doesn't require a lengthy apology. You don't owe anyone an explanation for needing rest, solitude, or simply not wanting to. That doesn't make you rude. It makes you real. And strangely enough, people begin to respect you more once you start saying no. Your silence carries weight. Your presence is no longer taken for granted. And your time, your most precious resource, is now spent the way you choose. If you're ready to rewrite the rules of your life, start with the simplest one: say no at the right time. And once you do, once you begin curating your relationships, your energy, your time, something else will appear. Space. No more pointless meetups. No more messages that demand immediate replies. At first, that space will feel unfamiliar. A little lonely silence might creep in. But hold on, don't label it too quickly, because it's in that space you will encounter one of the biggest misconceptions of modern life: loneliness is not the same as solitude. And the Stoics, more than anyone, understood that difference thousands of years ago. An empty space, or a gateway to freedom. How the Stoics understood the difference between loneliness and solitude. When you begin to say no to meaningless calls and stop rushing into every situation to prove you care, the first thing you face isn't freedom, it's emptiness. It's a quiet weekend afternoon and you're sitting on the sofa. No one's texting, no plans ahead, no sound except the AC's hum and the city's soft light outside. You don't have to do anything for the first time in years, and you have no idea what to do with that. The feeling is strange. Part of you feels relief, but another part buried deep inside starts to panic. No one's calling, no one's checking in. You suddenly realize maybe it's been a long time since you've sat alone in absolute silence. No TV, no phone, no social media alerts. Just you with yourself. At that moment, if you don't understand what's happening, you'll misread it. You'll think you're lonely. You'll believe something is wrong, that you must be missing someone to fill that space. And so you'll go back to the messages, the drama, the artificial busyness. Back to where you're constantly present but never truly there. But the Stoics see it differently. To them, that sense of emptiness is the first doorway to real freedom. The ability to sit in that moment and not fill it is a sign that your mind is beginning to self-govern. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You can retreat into your inner fortress at any time. And nowhere offers more peace than that place. That moment is when you step into that fortress. Loneliness is being cut off from others, even in a crowd. It's when you crave someone to validate your worth and no one shows up. But more accurately, intentional solitude is a conscious choice. It's when you welcome the absence of others, not because no one's there, but because you choose to be fully there for yourself. The Stoics call this inner self-sufficiency. Seneca wrote, "The wise man is content with himself, but if someone joins him, he welcomes them, not out of need, but out of want." The difference is this: a Stoic doesn't run from loneliness. They walk through it, and they emerge on the other side as someone entirely different. In America, this contrast is even more apparent. This is a country of busyness. People are always in a rush. They stack their schedules, line up meetings, and plan trips as if stopping might make them disappear. But even here, I've met people who chose differently. No weekend meetups, no networking dinners, no need for social approval. They retreat to a mountain cabin, live alone, read, write, and focus on intellectual work. And strangely, they're often the most peaceful people I have ever met. I once asked a man like that, a successful programmer who'd lived alone for years, if he ever felt lonely. He smiled and said, "You only feel lonely when you haven't learned to talk to yourself." But once you realize silence is a form of dialogue, being alone stops being scary. That reminded me of something Epictetus said: "You cannot be free unless you can control your own reactions." And the scariest part of loneliness isn't that no one's around, it's the inner chaos you have never learned how to face. Once you become comfortable in solitude, you see your unconscious patterns more clearly. Fear of abandonment, the need to be loved, and pressure to be in a relationship. None of these are absolute truths. They're invisible programs installed long ago by culture, media, society. Stoicism doesn't deny these things, but asks you to confront them. And in that silence, something else emerges. You realize you've never really known who you are when you're constantly reacting to the world. Only when no one is left to respond do you start to see yourself. If you've ever sat alone, not because no one came, but because you chose not to invite anyone, then you're standing at the edge of something profound. It's uncomfortable initially, but it's the foundation of inner sovereignty. And once you've walked through the fear of loneliness, the next thing you'll learn is one of the most important arts, the ability to master your time, your space, and your energy. Because once others no longer pull you, you finally start to design your own life. Designing your own life. When you stop living on someone else's schedule, you realize something quickly. Once you start living alone, most of your time before wasn't your own. You were living on someone else's schedule. Your company's schedule, your family's, your friends. The schedule of a partner who once had expectations of you. Invitations, obligations, and unspoken responsibilities could pull you away from yourself without realizing it. Think about it. How many times have you said, "Yeah, let me check my calendar," but it wasn't your calendar to begin with? You didn't want to go, but you were afraid to disappoint. You didn't want to say yes, but felt bad saying no. You had no time for yourself because you always thought you had to show up to maintain an image. When you enter the space of chosen solitude, what the Stoics call withdrawal to the inner citadel, you are not just stepping back from people, but away from their timelines. And that's where something valuable happens. You can redesign the rhythm of your life to fit who you actually are. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Don't give such weight to others' opinions that you end up living your whole life trying to please them." It sounds simple, but the weight of that insight can shift your entire day. When you stop running on someone else's schedule, you're forced to face one question. If no one's asking anything of me, what do I genuinely want to do today? And in that space, there's no excuse not to write the book you've meant to write. No one to blame for not showing up to a party. No guilt for not answering the phone. Because now you're living by your own calendar. In the US, I once met a man in his 40s who had worked at a major tech company. He left his job, moved to a small town on the California coast, and began living alone. He got up at 5:30, went for a run, read books, worked in the garden, and took on just a few freelance projects each month. I asked him, "Aren't you afraid of falling out of sync with the world?" He smiled. "I'm not out of sync. I'm finally living on my own rhythm." And that's the essence of sovereignty, living in rhythm with yourself, no matter how fast the world spins. But to reach that point, you must overcome FOMO, the fear of missing out, because the world will always make you feel like you're missing something. A relationship, an opportunity, a gathering. But Epictetus once said, "Freedom is understanding that you don't need what doesn't belong to you." And often other people's schedules are precisely that, not yours. Designing your life isn't just choosing what to do, choosing how to live with your desire. It means not just choosing to read, but reading during the part of the day when your mind is sharpest. Not just choosing to work, but working when your mind isn't being ripped apart by unnecessary noise. You start to realize mornings are when you need silence. Afternoons are for creating. Evenings are for reflection, meditation, or simply enjoying a hot tea. No reminders, no one is checking in, no buzzing notifications. Just you and a schedule you built and now protect. This is what the Stoics call self-governance, a concept that needs no constitution, no state authority, just one person with enough backbone not to get pulled off course from the orbit they have chosen for themselves. And when you live that way long enough, something strange happens. You no longer need iron discipline. Because what you do now isn't an obligation, it's a choice. When you genuinely want something, you don't need discipline. You need clarity. And when your schedule comes from clarity, you stop wasting energy fighting distractions. Seneca once wrote, "No one is busier than the person who doesn't know what they're busy with." People living on other people's schedules always feel fully booked, but emotionally empty. On the other hand, Stoics may have empty calendars, but their minds are full. Designing your own life is a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. Because when you no longer have anyone to blame, the company, the friends, the system, you're left with only yourself. And that isn't always comfortable, but nothing is more powerful. You'll have days when you work undisturbed. The next day might be heavy. You'll feel sadness and allow it. No pretending, no performance. You don't have to play a role in someone else's script because you're no longer acting in someone else's schedule. And you know what? That's precisely what draws the right people into your life, not because you're showing up for them, but because you're finally showing up for yourself. If you've made it this far, you're probably already wondering, have I ever truly lived by my calendar? If the answer is no, this is your moment. You don't need a major event to start, just one morning, one journal page, one uninterrupted hour. And from those small spaces, you'll begin to fill your life not with obligations, but with presence. And then once you've grown used to the stillness, once quiet nights without messages no longer unsettle you, a new question will begin to knock quietly. If no one else is here, who am I with no one watching, no one validating, no one to vent to or lean on what remains? That question is not comfortable. But it is a turning point, because in that moment, you don't just learn how to live alone, you begin to exist as a whole human being. When no one's around, who are you without the need for approval? There's a truth most people don't dare to face. Most of us live through the eyes of others. How we dress, speak, and even make decisions, big or small, are shaped by a quiet underlying question. What will people think of me? But when no one's around, when there are no compliments, no glances of approval, no one to say you're doing great, who are you? That question haunted me for years, especially during my first months living alone in America. No family, no close friends, no Vietnamese around. No one called to ask if I was okay. Those moments weren't just lonely, they were a confrontation. A silence so intense that every noise in my mind echoed loudly. And in that space, I realized something: I hadn't been living for myself. I had been living for validation. Living in a society like America, where performance, achievement, and recognition feel like a kind of religion, it's easy to get trapped in a never-ending chase. Grades, resumes, likes, networks, mentions in meetings. Here, personal worth is often measured by your ability to impress. But Stoicism gave me a different lens. You don't need to be seen to be valuable. In fact, it's when no one is watching, when no one is clapping, that what you do truly reflects who you are. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Don't wait for the applause of others. If what you're doing is right, the act itself is your reward." Stoicism doesn't teach you to chase the spotlight. It teaches you to do the right thing even if no one claps. And in single life, where there's no audience, no one to perform for every action, becomes a quiet question. Who am I when I don't need praise? I remember one cold night in early winter, walking out of my university library in New York after finishing a long paper. No one was waiting for me at home. No one asked how many pages I'd written. No one even knew I had just completed a difficult philosophy essay. And yet, strangely, I felt proud. Not because I had proven anything to the world, but because I had just won a battle with myself. A victory no one saw, but one that meant everything. That's when I began to understand the Stoic idea of internalizing approval, something Epictetus emphasized: don't let your happiness depend on anything outside your control. When you're still chasing validation from others, you're handing over the keys to your fate. You're letting them decide if today was a win or a loss, if you matter or don't. But when you turn your gaze inward, you leave that game. You no longer need to post a story to prove you were productive. You don't need to tell someone you had a tough day. You don't need anyone to call you strong. Because you know you did the right thing. That's enough. That's what Marcus Aurelius called the inner citadel, a fortress no one can enter unless you invite them in. And then one day you'll find you're no longer restless when no one texts, no longer anxious when no one sees your work. Because you who witnessed every effort, every failure, every recovery are the only one who truly needs to know. And when that happens, you're not just surviving the silence, you're living in it. Many people fear being alone because it proves they don't matter. But in Stoicism, living alone and still being able to define your own worth is one of the highest forms of freedom. You're no longer dragged by public opinion and no longer ruled by the fear of not being noticed. No longer worried about being left behind, because you no longer need someone to hold your hand. You walk on your own. When you stop, look inward, and accept, I may not be special in anyone else's eyes, but I don't have to be to have value. That's when you take back your power. Confidence means standing on a stage and boldly speaking your truth. But absolute confidence sometimes means not needing to say anything at all and not needing to prove a thing. Just living in quiet alignment with who you are day after day. And if you're living in the silence, unseen, unrecognized, unvalidated, remember this: no one needs to witness your blooming as long as you know you are no longer just a shadow. So now, walk forward with a new question. A question Stoic philosophy never shied away from. When no one is left beside you, are you strong enough to face yourself in the silence? Chaos in moments that seem to mean nothing. Strength doesn't arise from applause. There was a period in America when I worked at a media company where every action, big or small, could be recognized or entirely forgotten. You might receive applause for a polished presentation, a smooth meeting, or a project delivered on time. Yet right there, I witnessed a profound truth. The person who hears the most applause is often not the strongest. And the strongest person usually quietly does what's most important, in silence. I recall one Friday evening. The office was dark except for me and a barely noticed IT engineer named Marcus. He didn't show up at team building events, nor did he post on Slack. That night, he quietly handled a critical security vulnerability that could have jeopardized thousands of clients' data. Nobody knew what he was doing. Nobody applauded him. No office photo appeared online the next morning, yet he still acted because he knew it had to be done. That was when I truly understood what Stoics mean by the inner citadel, a fortress within. Marcus didn't need applause, recognition, or praise. He operated on an internal standard, ethical clarity, a spirit of service without expectation. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor and one of Stoicism's greatest minds, once wrote, "Be a rock that the waves continually crash against, but that stands unshaken and makes the waves break themselves." That strength doesn't come from recognition. It comes from an inner fortitude forged in silence, forged by doing the right thing over and over, even when no one is watching. I realize that most of us, whether in America or anywhere, that grow up in a culture that craves recognition, from childhood medals to followers, likes, praise from bosses, partners, friends. We do what's right, yet feel restless if it goes unseen. We help others, yet feel slighted if not thanked. Gradually, we begin to depend on applause as emotional fuel. Without it, we fall into emptiness. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Epictetus said, "When you do the right thing, don't expect a reward. That very act is the reward." In other words, righteous action must have integrity and not rely on external validation. That's where real strength grows. I used to be terrible at this. Every action snuck a peek over the shoulder. Are they seeing me? Who is recognizing me? This dependence consumed me. If no one noticed, I'd lose motivation. A single criticism would throw me off. I didn't act from value, but from reflection. I didn't live as an independent being, but as a mirror only shining when illuminated by others. Then I started writing each morning in silence, just sitting and writing for 30 minutes each day as a discipline of will and consistency. No applause, no one is watching. But after 3 months, I noticed a change. I no longer needed recognition for this habit. I felt complete simply because I honored a promise to myself. That is where inner strength begins. In moments when no one notices, applauds, or shares your story, yet you still act. Seneca once said, "We are not born to please others, but to live rightly according to reason." This starkly contrasts modern culture where followers, shares, and reactions appraise us. In that world, someone who doesn't need recognition may be seen as odd, cold, or passionless. But Stoicism teaches that someone who doesn't need acclaim is the one who can keep the flame burning even when the wind is gone. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying recognition is bad. Applause can be beautiful when it's a natural byproduct. But if you live to chase it, you become the crowd's actor, not your warrior. And the crowd changes its mind. Today they cheer, and tomorrow they turn away. If you only react to external signals, you'll enter an endless spiral of uncertainty. You need an internal operating system, an ethical standard that doesn't require an audience, a way of acting that doesn't rely on someone sharing your post. That's where inner strength truly forms. In American startup culture where I once worked, there's a term for quiet operator. People who don't make noise or promote themselves, quietly keep everything running smoothly. They don't chase the spotlight, they don't chase power, they don't need a flashy profile. Yet they are the backbone of the organization. They embody Stoicism in action, steadfast, independent, unmoved by praise or criticism. And I realized that you don't just become stronger when you build inner strength like that. You become freer, not swayed by public opinion, not dependent on praise or critique, not living by someone else's rhythm. Strength doesn't come from applause, it comes from standing firm when no one is clapping. And when you've built that strength independent of validation, something strange happens. You become unpredictable to others. You don't react to expectations. The crowd's emotions don't easily sway you. But then another truth emerges: the world isn't comfortable with someone who's self-governing. Because when you don't need them, you become formidable. Such sovereignty, when deeply realized, is more than mental strength. It's a stealth art of living present without dependency, acting without explanation, living without permission. And that's when you step into the next layer of Stoic understanding, the hidden presence of the sovereign soul. There's a type of person modern society doesn't quite know what to do with, someone who requires no validation. They don't broadcast their freedom or declare themselves different. They simply disappear, not out of fear or weakness, but from deliberate retreat. Not in avoidance, but from strength to no longer need to showcase. Once I thought invisibility was a sign of failure and exile by society. But living longer in America, where everyone is urged to show up, post, engage meaningfully, I began to understand constant visibility isn't the same as truly living. It can be an energy game. The more you show up, the more you're drained. So I began doing something strange. I stopped replying to unnecessary messages, unfollowed accounts that added no value. I froze my Facebook account and posted nothing on Instagram, allowing friends to wonder if I was alive. And naturally, I became invisible, yet felt more present within myself than ever. The Stoics call this strategic invisibility. It's not evading life, but choosing where you stand within your own life. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "A wise man can live in a city amid crowds and noise, while his heart is still home in a mountaintop retreat." He wasn't withdrawing into the woods, retreating from relationships. I was shedding the invisible chains I'd once worn, and realized this true power isn't in being seen, it's in being unaffected. Here in America, many live as though they must broadcast life 24/7. Everyone curates a personal brand, from email signatures to Zoom avatars. Yet in doing so, many lose the portion of life that's theirs alone. When you invite someone to meet for coffee without check-in, or walk without selfies, or hang out without posting it, some call it meaningless, because if it's not online, it didn't happen. But to a Stoic, the unshared is sacred. I remember declining a weekend networking event, a golden opportunity by American standards. They said, "Are you not serious about your career?" I just smiled, not because I didn't care, but because I was being serious. With myself, I'd rather spend that time reading Meditations, a book Marcus Aurelius wrote for himself, not for show. I realized that some loud conversations shape us less than a quiet afternoon with an old book. When you begin to choose to disappear from the places where you are unnecessary, something strange happens. The world doesn't collapse. Longtime friends stop texting. Hollow invitations fade, and in their place is space, silence, time, the clarity to see how much of your life was lived for you and how much was for the gaze of others. Seneca once warned, "It's not that we have too little time, but that we waste so much on things that aren't ours." Bit by bit, I saw the truth of that. When I stopped checking my phone every 0.5 minutes, I lost nothing yet regained focus. When I stepped out of meaningless chatter, I wasn't left behind, I moved forward. I remember a close friend once said, "You've been cold lately, distant." I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I said, "I'm learning to live with sovereignty." Silence. Then I was blocked. In the end, I lost an 8-year friendship. Did it hurt? Yes. But I also felt lighter. For the first time, I didn't beg anyone to understand me. I chose myself without guilt. The price of invisibility may be loneliness, but it's sovereign loneliness. You step into the darkness not because you're weaker than the light, but because you know false light can burn what's most genuine. As Epictetus said, "Freedom begins when you no longer seek to please others." This wasn't a rebellion. It was intentional to let go. I once lived to be recognized. Now I live to know myself. I used to speak in every group chat. Now conversation can pass through me without guilt. I feared being misunderstood. Now I can be misjudged and not corrected. I felt compelled to be present. Now I know that absence at the right moment carries more power than constant presence. A sovereign soul doesn't shout, "I am myself." They don't need validation. They move like water, quiet, flowing true to their own course. They disappear not to vanish, but to remain unmanipulated. If you've ever felt stuck between wanting to withdraw and fear of being forgotten, remember the more you appear, the more you may lose. Sometimes your absence makes the strongest statement, I choose me. One day you'll realize you don't have to answer every invitation, be in every social circle, or explain every choice. Growing into yourself, you discover that you live not to be understood, but to stay true to yourself. Invisibility isn't an ending. It's the pause before your quiet power ignites. And what comes next is your transformation. A transformation that knows true sovereignty has a cost. Will you dare to pay it? The price of sovereignty. Sovereignty sounds grand, but let's be honest, there's no path to inner freedom without a cost. When I began living in alignment with what felt true, ignoring immediate messages, saying no when someone asked for help, and stepping away from spaces that didn't serve me, I thought I'd earn respect. Instead, I encountered silence, suspicion, and rejection. People weren't used to someone who could refuse. Someone who used to say yes now said nothing was to them a betrayal. To me, it was my first touch of freedom. Once I turned down a major collaboration simply because its values didn't match my direction. That night I lay awake, not regretting the money, but questioning, am I making things too hard for myself? Then I remembered what Marcus Aurelius wrote, do what is right and leave the rest to fate. What remains after hard choices isn't victory, but pride. Sovereignty often means standing alone. No applause, no cheering. Nobody is calling you the kind one anymore. You're no longer that lovable, accommodating type. At first there's a void, but feel it because it takes you to a new level where you don't need approval to know you're right. Epictetus said, true freedom begins when you need nothing other than self-control. Easy to say, hard to live. Sovereignty demands leaving comfort zones, places where people like you only because you're easy. You begin drawing boundaries. You stop emotionally rescuing others. You stop pretending to be okay so others won't feel awkward. And right then you see you're on the edge of a new world where you're no longer everyone's nice one, but the person your own self cannot ignore. Sovereignty never comes cheaply. It means facing solitude not because you're unloved, but because you've grown less accommodating. You start to see how many relationships existed not from alignment, but because you were easy to keep. And when you're not easy anymore, they leave. That's when you realize sovereignty isn't just personal, it's a cleanse. Loneliness is part of the price. Sitting alone in your quiet apartment on a Friday night when everyone else posts stories. No invites, no rubber stamp presents. Yet strangely, no longer excluded, but free. Because no one is acting in your role, no one expects you to be cheerful, available, and present on cue. You get to live to your own rhythm. And in that emptiness, you hear something silent for too long, your voice. A whisper not loud, not urgent, but persistent. At last, here I am. Sovereignty isn't rebellion, but a return against losing yourself. Seneca said, if you don't value yourself, don't be surprised if nobody else does. When you stop lowering yourself to be loved, to be kept, not to be left, you enter the territory of sovereign people. There, you don't need acceptance. You need to be true. The cost of sovereignty is losing charm in others' eyes, no more bending in every situation. No more dodging the truth to avoid hurting feelings. And yes, it makes some people uncomfortable because they were used to someone who's usable, predictable, forgettable. But that discomfort is theirs to process if they want to travel with someone who's truly grown. Here's the harsh truth. Sovereignty isn't celebrated. It's not an Instagram moment. You'll never see a comment saying, wow, you're so brave, but you'll know it's the right path when you look in the mirror, not to admire your face, but to confront your being and feel peace. You'll sleep better even though fewer people invite you for coffee. You'll breathe easier even though fewer messages flood your phone. You'll work more clearly even without someone pushing you forward. You'll feel clean not because you're perfect, but because you stopped pretending. That's the price. But the reward is real freedom. Not freedom to do whatever you want, but freedom not to do anything against yourself. And when you touch that truth, you see why Stoicism isn't cold. It's a radiant art of living, written in sweat blood, and when you stood your ground without falling. You have reached the end of this journey, not out of curiosity, but because something inside you would never submit. Perhaps it's that quiet, persistent whisper in your soul, the inner knowing that you were never meant to live by someone else's template. We grow up with fairy tales that end with, and they lived happily ever after. But no one tells you that between getting married and happiness lies a long path of obligations, expectations, and self-abandonment. No one teaches you this truth. Real happiness doesn't come from having someone beside you, but from having yourself literally with you. Stoic philosophy never preaches you must stay single. It simply states one clear truth. Don't let anything outside control your mind, be it success, public opinion, or someone you call lover. If a relationship costs you your inner freedom, if you live by thinking rather than being authentic, then you're trading yourself to maintain harmony with others. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a way of life that demands readiness to be uncheered, misunderstood, and unsympathetic. It's when you learn to remain calm in a world that constantly wants you to react, appease, and conform. You may dine alone without shame. You may decline an invitation without offering excuses. You may do what feels right for you without needing validation. That is when you know you are beginning to claim sovereignty over your life. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Confine yourself to the present. When you stop worrying about what others think or how they judge you can truly live in the now. And only in the present can you make decisions from reason, not fear." I'm not writing this to tell you to shun love. On the contrary, I write this so you can enter any relationship in a different posture, that of someone already whole. You need no one to fill a void. Do not expect anyone to rescue you from loneliness. Because you have walked through loneliness, looked it in the face, and understood it didn't destroy you. It forged you into steel. And if you genuinely choose this path of inner sovereignty, know that it is not easy. Sometimes you feel weary, isolated in a world that never stops screaming. But that is the cost of freedom. And it is a cost worth paying. There is a phrase by Epictetus I'd like to leave you with. Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. If you understand this not merely as logic, but from life experience, you are no longer like the rest of the world. If you're still here, you are ready to choose yourself even when no one chooses you. Prepared to walk forward even if you walk alone. Ready to live authentically even if it makes you appear out of step. If this message resonates with you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to someone you feel has grown weary of living by other people's expectations. And if you are ready to continue building that inner fortress where peace doesn't depend on anyone and you alone steer the ship, subscribe to the Sovereign Stoic channel. Because freedom doesn't begin with applause. It begins when you have the courage to live on your own terms without anyone's permission.